afternoon. Welcome, everyone, to the Military Personnel Subcommittee of the Armed Services Committee. I want to thank the active duty transgender service members who are with us today. Being here in the same room as senior Defense Department officials in front of Congress, representing yourselves and your fellow transgender service members, even in your civilian capacities, takes tremendous courage. Somehow, testifying in front of Congress is not close to the most courageous thing you have done. From a young age, you have made a series of difficult choices in order to live in a way that honors yourselves, your communities, and your country. Despite living in a nation where many discriminate against you, you made a choice that fewer and fewer Americans make. You joined the military and risked your lives and your family's well-beings for our safety. And how has the administration thanked you? By treating you like a liability, not an asset. By maliciously jeopardizing your careers and trivializing your sacrifice. 14,700 transgender individuals continue to serve ably. They are exceptional, but also exceptionally normal. Like their fellow soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines, they proudly serve the Constitution, our nation, and the Commander-in-Chief. Our 5 witnesses today have shown uncommon bravery, making choices throughout their lives. And today, Lieutenant Commander Dremen, Captain Stellick, Captain Peace, Hospital Corpsman 3rd Class Wyatt, and Staff Sergeant King have made the courageous choice to come advocate for themselves and their peers. I cannot tell you how much I appreciate your courage, your sacrifices, and your presence here today. Your examples inspire all of us. I feel strongly that any transgender person who can meet occupational standards should be allowed to serve in our armed forces. I believe that transgender service ban is discriminatory, unconstitutional, and self-defeating. Open transgender service the last 2.5 years has been an unequivocal success. When asked by Congress, the 5 service chiefs indicated that open service has not caused unit readiness or cohesion problems. Let me repeat that. When the chiefs were asked this question, they made it clear that unit readiness and cohesion were not impacted by the service of transgender service members. Instead, discharging transgender service members would hamper unit readiness, robbing formations of needed security personnel, intelligence officers, and leaders without warning. Not allowing transgender service members to join the military would cost us recruits at a time so few Americans are willing to serve. Telling transgender service members they can serve but not fully express their identities would represent a return to the fraught paranoia of don't ask, don't tell. Transgender troops have the right to serve as their full selves and shouldn't have to live in fear of being found out. Our 5 witnesses and their peers deserve better than to have bias, misconception, and ignorance end or limit their careers. Let me tell you a little more about the 5 witnesses joining us today. They are subject matter experts who have lived open transgender service and best understand how it affects our unit readiness and cohesion. Lieutenant Commander Blake Dremen. I think we're going to see a photograph. There she is. There we go. There he is. Lieutenant Commander Blake Dremen has served in the Navy for over 15 years, since joining in 2003. He has been recognized for his exemplary service as the recipient of the USS Maine Logistics Excellence Award and the 2015 Vice Admiral Robert F. Batchelder Award. Thank you. Captain Olivia Stellick, your picture in uniform. Has been serving in the Army for over 10 years, since commissioning out of West Point as a second lieutenant in 2008. She served as an infantry officer and completed the Ranger course. Captain Stellick deployed to Afghanistan with the Stryker Brigade Combat Team. Her personal awards include the Bronze Star Medal and the Meritorious Service Medal. Thank you. Captain Jennifer Peace has served for over 15 years since first enlisting in the Army in 2003 and commissioning as an officer in 2009. Through numerous combat deployments to Iraq and Afghanistan and positions of command, she has excelled as an intelligence officer. Now selected for promotion to Major, Captain Peace's awards include the Meritorious Service Medal and the Joint Service Commendation Medal. Thank you. Hospital Corpsman, 3rd Class, Akira Wyatt, emigrated to the United States from the Philippines at age 15. She has served over 7 years since enlisting in the U.S. Navy in 2011 and continues to serve as a corpsman with Marine infantry units. She has deployed numerous times across the globe. Her personal awards include the Navy Marine Corps Achievement Medal. Thank you. And Staff Sergeant Patricia King, a combat-tested infantry soldier who has served 19 years in the United States Army. She has deployed to Afghanistan 3 times and has served across the globe. Her awards include the Combat Infantryman's Badge and the Bronze Star. Thank you. Thank you all for your contributions to our nation and to our military. You are the first 5 transgender service members ever to testify openly in front of the House of Representatives. The very first 5. And how fitting that you do it not as individuals, but as a team. How just that you can at last represent yourselves and your peers in front of this body. My colleagues and I need to hear from you, understand your stories, and appreciate what you've done. We have the opportunity to pass legislation such as the bill I introduced earlier this month that would allow transgender service members to join and also serve openly. Congress cannot let the administration's discriminatory impulses win out. Before we make that decision, we need to meet you face to face, to look you in the eye, to affirm that service by openly transgender troops is normal, it's necessary, and it is just. Today is an opportunity for all of us and the department to learn about why you've serving and what you've accomplished. This is time to learn and not to peddle in misconceptions, bad science, and bias. So let's dispel the phony myths. There is simply no rigorous evidence that transgender service members hamper unit cohesion or readiness. A consensus of top medical and psychological bodies, including the American Medical Association and the APA, have concluded that gender dysphoria does not pose a barrier to service. Transgender service members are deployable and effective. Their sense of duty, patriotism, and courage is no different from the other service members they stand shoulder to shoulder with. Those are the facts. Our witnesses will be able to illustrate them with their stories and their expertise. Also joining us is Dr. Jesse Ehrenfeld, the Joseph A. Johnson Jr. Distinguished Leadership Professor, that is a mouthful, at the Vanderbilt University School of Medicine. He was elected to the American Medical Association Board of Trustees in 2014. He is a combat veteran who has deployed to Afghanistan. Dr. Ehrenfeld has worked for years to capture and support the lives of LGBTQ people. Thank you. Before hearing from our first panel, let me offer our ranking member, Kelly, an opportunity to make his opening remarks.
Thank you, Chairman Spear. And I want to thank the three witnesses who came by my office earlier and met with me and told me your stories in person, out of the view of a camera. I want to thank you for doing that, and I want to thank all of you for being here on this panel today and for your service to this great nation, to our great nation. I wish to welcome both of our panels in today's hearing. The House Armed Services Committee has tirelessly focused over the past several years on rebuilding the readiness of our armed forces after years of demanding cuts. An integral part of rebuilding and maintaining readiness is recruiting and retaining qualified, effective, and able-bodied service members. To me, personnel is the key. Equipment can always be replaced, but personnel is the key cornerstone in all military operations. One of the strengths of our military is that we draw from a diverse group of individuals from varied backgrounds and experiences. As former Secretary of Defense Mattis made clear, it is a bedrock principle of the Department of Defense that any eligible individual who can meet the high standards for military service without special accommodations should be permitted to serve. In other words, the focus should remain on individuals' capabilities rather than establishing blanket policies for certain groups. In reading through the written statements of our first panel of currently serving transgender service members and also my meeting earlier, it is clear that you have all earned the respect and support of your commands, you have achieved much, and you continue to serve honorably. One common theme throughout all of your statements and our meeting earlier is that you all met, meet, or exceed the standards for accession and retention in the military, and that you did not ask for, nor would you have wanted, reduced standards or special treatment. The transgender service policy must, like the medical accession standards for all recruits, include all individualized assessment of the recruit's medical and behavioral health to determine whether they are fit for service. It is when we put in place categorical exceptions for certain groups that we undermine our military's readiness. I look forward to hearing from our first panel about their experience in the service. Through your written statements and in the office, you indicate that you generally have supportive leaders throughout your transitions. I look forward to hearing your recommendations for how the services can improve their support. I'm also interested to hear from our second panel about the differences between the current transgender service policy and the policy established by former Secretary of Defense Mattis. In reviewing that policy, it seems to me that it eliminates categorical distinctions between different groups of people in favor of individual assessments of a recruit's medical readiness based on standards applicable to all. I look forward to hearing the current status of that policy. It is an unfortunate reality that not every person who desires to serve in our military meets the stringent medical and behavioral health standards needed to maintain a ready and resilient force. However, it only makes sense that any individual who can meet these standards be allowed to serve. Be ready to fight and be ready to fight tonight. It's all about readiness and deployability. With that, I look forward to hearing from both of our panels, and I yield back, Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Kelly. I ask unanimous consent to allow members not on the subcommittee to participate in today's hearing and be allowed to ask questions after all subcommittee members have been recognized. Without objection, so ordered. Each witness will have the opportunity to present his or her testimony, and each member will have an opportunity to question the witnesses for 5 minutes. We respectfully ask the witnesses to summarize their testimony in 5 minutes or less. Your written comments and statements will be made part of the hearing record. With that, let us begin with Commander Dremen. You have your opening statement.
Madam Chairwoman, Ranking Member Kelly, members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today about our experiences contributing to the readiness and lethality of our armed forces. I am Lieutenant Commander Blake Dremen, and I am currently assigned as a supply chain manager for the DoD's nuclear enterprise. I have served in the Navy for 13 years, and I have deployed 11 times, including 5 patrols on the USS Denver, 1 year in Afghanistan with the 101st Airborne, and 5 strategic deterrent patrols on board USS Maine, a ballistic missile submarine. I've been told 3 times that something other than my capability to do the job was the reason I wasn't worthy of an opportunity. First, for my gender assigned at birth. Second, for my sexual orientation prior to transition. And third, for my gender identity. In 2010, the Navy changed the policy preventing women from serving on submarines. And in 2011, Congress repealed Don't Ask, Don't Tell. This opened the opportunity for me to be selected as one of the first women to integrate submarines. And for the first time, I did not have to hide my sexual orientation. Each time a mission or capability irrelevant barrier was removed, I rose to the occasion. I succeeded as a submariner and was ranked the top supply officer out of 14 supply officers in the squadron. However, despite all of my success, there was still something that needed to change. I began my transition in 2013, 2 weeks prior to my 4th patrol and before policy had changed for transgender service members. The next year, I was a more confident officer, a better leader, and a better shipmate. It culminated in my ship being named the top boat in the squadron in 2000, and in 2015, I won the Navy League's Vice Admiral Batchelder Award given to the top 5 junior officers for their contributions to the operational readiness of the fleet. Recently, I've served on the Joint Staff and at the Pentagon, and now I'm at a Joint Logistics Command. I've continually exceeded expectations and met all the requirements to be fully deployable. Open service afforded me the opportunity to not only be who I am, but also act as an educator and advocate on behalf of my service members. In my personal capacity as president of Sparta, a nonprofit that supports and educates and advocates on behalf of over 800 service members who happen to be transgender, it is my responsibility to know and understand the policies of all 5 armed services. My team and I have coordinated with policy experts and commanders from each service when there are delays or issues to help them be solved as quickly as possible. We've worked to eliminate any confusion in the transgender policy, providing practical implementation solutions, and emphasizing that good leadership is the key to success. It was the same with women on submarines. It was the same with Don't Ask, Don't Tell. Good leaders can take a team and make it work. Great leaders mold their teams to exceed expectations because it doesn't matter if you're female or LGBT. What matters is that each member is capable and focused on the mission. Each time the military has incorporated a minority group, it was met with the same resistance, citing fears about mission accomplishment, unit cohesion, and morale. Each time it was forecast that sexual harassment charges or privacy issues would be rampant. For me, whether it was because of my sex at birth, my sexual orientation, or my gender identity, each accusation has been found completely without merit. We've busted myths that women can't be submariners, that gays and lesbians will be a detriment to unit cohesion, and that trans service members are incapable of service. Readiness and lethality of our military cannot be maintained by closing the doors to the best and brightest our country has to offer. It just so happens that some of the best and brightest we have to offer happen to be transgender.
Thank you very much. Captain Stellick?
Ma'am, sir, good afternoon. Members of the committee, good afternoon. My name is Captain Olivia Stellick. Ever since I was a kid, I wanted to be in the Army. In 2004, I followed in my dad's footsteps and went to West Point. I graduated from the United States Military Academy in 2008 and commissioned as an infantry officer. I spent nearly 6 years as an infantry officer as both a platoon leader and a staff officer, and during that time, I discovered I had a passion not just for the Army, but for taking care of soldiers. I decided to become an Army physical therapist because I believe that soldiers deserve medical providers who've walked in their shoes, who understand what their life is like, and who've lived it. I have. I've led the long ruck marches. I've spent the long nights out in the field in the rain and the cold. I've endured weekend training. I've also earned my Ranger tab and my Expert Infantry badge, as well as my Airborne and Air Assault wings. I've lived a soldier's life. I graduated from the Army's physical therapy program in 2016 and was assigned to the hospital at Fort Carson in Colorado. A year later, I heard that a brigade at Fort Carson would be deploying to Afghanistan and that their current physical therapist wouldn't be able to go because she was pregnant. We had a short discussion, and a short time later, we switched places so that I could go to Afghanistan with the unit. The unit otherwise wouldn't have had a physical therapist for that deployment. Despite my desire to return to an infantry unit, I had some concerns. I had excelled as an infantry officer, earning top marks from my commanders, but I never quite fit in. In 2016, when the ban on transgender service was lifted, I took steps to change that and began my transition. Given that my profession now is one in which I touch every person I meet, I was concerned that my transition might be a problem, that I might be less effective if people were uncomfortable with my life. This really brings me to the crux of today's hearing. What is the value of having transgender people in the military? Based on my experience both as a combat arms officer and as a medical provider in the United States Army, the answer is unequivocally that my transition, as well as those of so many others, has dramatically increased the readiness and lethality of every branch of the armed forces. I was mentally, emotionally, and physiologically stable throughout my transition, and my work performance improved. Within my first 2 months of having a full patient caseload as a new therapist, I was exceeding productivity standards for a seasoned therapist. I had only been out and on hormone replacement therapy for 6 months when I attended my branch's captain's career course. Per Army regulations at that time, I passed the PT test on male standards, graduated 8 out of 107, and was asked to come back and teach as a guest instructor. More recently, I served as the physical therapist for the eastern region of Afghanistan, where I treated over 1,700 patients. My care resulted in a less than 1% medical evacuation rate within my brigade for musculoskeletal injuries. It's clear that my presence in Afghanistan dramatically improved the readiness of my unit. But more than the numbers, I'm proud that my soldiers trusted me and knew that I would go out of my way to take care of them. Soldiers matter to me, and they're the ones who will suffer if medical providers and leaders like me are banned from service. Has my transition made soldiers uncomfortable? Absolutely not. On the contrary, during my recent deployment to Afghanistan, soldiers opened up. They talked to me and told me things they never would have before, things that they said they've never told other people. I asked them why, and the consistent answer was that they valued my authenticity, my courage in being myself. It allowed them to do the same thing. You can imagine how valuable that is, both as a consultant to the commander and as a medical provider. I got the ground truth on what was going on both in their personal lives, their medical conditions, as well as the whole of the unit, and was able to relay those things to the commander, as well as make better medical decisions for soldiers. While I was concerned that my presence might feel invasive to other women, I can tell you that they welcomed me into their lives, all of them, and into their living spaces with open arms. I was family. I returned to the United States from Afghanistan just over a month ago. My experience in Afghanistan has only confirmed what I already knew, that I am a more effective soldier, officer, and physical therapist having gone through transition. I belong in a combat arms unit taking care of my soldiers. I worked tirelessly to ensure that nothing could jeopardize that, and I continue to do so. It might be tempting to say that I am the exception, but that's simply not true. Transgender service members around the world have done the same thing, add to the readiness and lethality of the United States military. Transgender people should be allowed to join the military. People who are in the military should be allowed to seek health care for whatever issues they might have, whether it's trans-related or not. And those of us who are serving openly should be allowed every professional opportunity that every other soldier is. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Captain. Captain Peace.
Chairwoman Spear, Ranking Member Kelly, and members of the committee, thank you for your time this afternoon. My name is Captain Jennifer Peace. I'm a military intelligence officer currently assigned as the executive officer for the Iranian division of the Defense Intelligence Agency at Joint Base Anacostia Bowling. I've been in the military for 15 years, 5 of those as an enlisted service member, and almost 10 years as a commissioned officer after going through the officer candidate course in 2009. I was a non-commissioned officer of the year in 2008 at Fort Huachuca, Arizona, and I was the Distinguished Honor Graduate for the Military Intelligence Captain's Career Course. I've had a number of accolades throughout my career, but as Captain Stellick said, I don't consider myself to be an exception, but rather a prime example of what any other transgender service member could do. My most recent assignment was as a company commander, built upon years of experience to deployments to Baghdad, Iraq, Kandahar, Afghanistan, Malaysia, Japan, South Korea, and other locations across the world. When I took command of the headquarters company, 189th Infantry Brigade, my brigade commander was asked, "Is this a social experiment, making a transgender person a company commander?" My brigade commander, an infantry colonel, very clearly stated, "I do not experiment with command positions. They are too important." I served as a company commander for 18 months, leading soldiers across the United States to train National Guard and Reserve units who were preparing to deploy overseas. I went to the field with my unit. I trained with my unit. We were out for extended time periods in the field, in the deserts of California and in the forests of Wisconsin. There were never any issues that arose due to being transgender, and between the time of the initial announcement of open service and then the tweets by the commander-in-chief, the fact that I was transgender never came up. It wasn't something that needed to be discussed, and it is only since this issue has arisen again that it has even been talked about in my unit. I can certainly understand the issues of readiness as a company commander. Readiness and morale were two of my primary concerns as a company commander, and what I can tell you is that no one cares about readiness more than a company commander. I will be the first person to kick out a transgender service member if they are not able to meet the standards, if they are unable to deploy, engage, and destroy the enemies of the United States. There should be absolutely no adjustment of standards, no different standards for trans people than anyone else in the military. All we are asking for is the opportunity to meet and be held to those exact same standards. I think it's also important that we disabuse ourselves of the fact that this policy only impacts those who would like to join the military, that it doesn't affect active duty trans service members. The first thing that will happen is all of those who are currently serving will be locked into their career where they can no longer advance. Enlisted soldiers cannot become warrant officers. They cannot become officers in the United States military. If you're required to leave service for any period, you will not be allowed to rejoin. If there are any programs that you're attempting to get into, such as going to college, that will require you to exit and leave the military, even for a period of minutes, in order to rejoin and reassess, you will no longer be allowed to. But then you also have to look at the fact that now the Commander-in-Chief, the Vice President, the Secretary of Defense, and the Secretary of State have all said that I am not qualified to serve in the United States Army despite my 15 years. If I'm sitting on a board looking at evaluations for promotion, for schooling opportunities, or to invest additional resources into a transgender soldier, am I going to do that knowing that the chain of command at the highest levels had said this person shouldn't be in the military? If I know that the President of the United States is making a concerted effort to kick this member out, am I going to continue to invest my limited time, energy, and resources in allowing this soldier to continue to serve? Or am I going to let their careers languish as I focus on those who I know will be around tomorrow, due to no fault of their own, due to no limitations that they possess, but due to the choices of the President of the United States? I think it's also important to look at how this is going to affect the broader population. Whether deserved or not, there is a hero culture that has arisen in the military over the last decade. All of us get thanked for our service and called heroes almost every day that we go out amongst the public. Officers and non-commissioned officers in the military are regularly rated as some of the most respected professions in the United States. So now if transgender people can no longer join the military, if they can't be awarded meritorious service medals, Purple Hearts, if they can't deploy around the world, if they are told they are not good enough to serve the United States military, then now the entire United States sees trans people as somehow less. I think it is unfortunate that we are not able to appear in uniform today so that you could see us testifying with our rank and our accolades and speaking from a position of authority in the uniforms that we wear every day. I think it's unfortunate that we're here in civilian clothes testifying on our own, while the Department of Defense, speaking on authority to kick out 15,000 transgender service members, is appearing in those uniforms. As the executive officer of the Iranian division, I look every day at the threats coming not only from Iran, Russia, North Korea, ISIS and other non-state actors, China, the numerous threats that we face around the world, and I know that the Army missed its recruiting goal by 11,000 soldiers across the reserves, active, and National Guard last year alone. The Marines, the Navy, and the Air Force barely met their recruiting goals. I'm not sure that this is a time, as we face potential adversaries across the world, that we should be limiting our talent pool to a significant portion of the population who serves as twice the rate as their counterparts. Thank you for your time this afternoon, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Captain. Staff Sergeant King.
Chairwoman Spear, Ranking Member Kelly, and members of the committee, thank you for being here today. My name is Staff Sergeant Patricia King. I have served in the Army for 19 years, deployed to Afghanistan 3 times, the first time in 2001 as part of the initial invasion force, while participating in Operations Anaconda, Harpoon, and Glock. Over these combat deployments, I've earned the Combat Infantry Badge, a device that is highly esteemed within the Army for actions taken in the Shiakat Valley, and the Bronze Star during my 3rd deployment for completing 12 months in deployment as a platoon sergeant with no incidents or loss of life. In that time, I led or planned over 400 missions outside the wire as the PSD platoon sergeant for the RC South region. I began my gender transition in 2015 and came out to my leaders that March. Since transition, I've served as a squad leader, a platoon sergeant, a division plans NCO, and an operations NCO. In June of 2016, I took control of a striker squad at Fort Lewis, Washington. When I first arrived to my platoon, there was no issue of me being transgender. Rather, the fact that I was a female was more noticeable. In 2016, I was one of only 2 women in all of the United States Army Infantry. My building, 50 years old and still having asbestos removed at the time, had been built without women's restrooms, much to the chagrin of any spouse that might have visited their soldier during the workday. Being the creative thinkers that we are, we quickly made flip signs that had a blue male on one side and a pink female on the other. Since I was the oneness was on me to flip the sign when I needed to use the restroom. That pink female sign kind of represented my first few weeks there. Wherever I went, I was the pink sign in the room. When I would come in, there would be a hush that fell over the room for fear of saying the wrong thing. However, it didn't take long before my peers saw past my gender, and the only thing that mattered was that I could do my job. I'd been an infantryman for over 15 years. I was one of them. I just happened to be a girl. From the get-go, none of that mattered to the soldiers in my squad. Most of them were 21 years old or younger. People in Generation Z simply aren't worried about trans very much. Much like their iPhones or Facebook, they grew up with trans people in their lives. They watch I Am Jazz. Their generation has trans prom queens from Missouri, Florida, and Wisconsin, just to name a few. Laverne Cox is a household name for Generation Z, much like we grew up with Laverne and Shirley. My squad quickly gave me the nickname Squad Mom. For us, this was a term of endearment. There'd never been a squad mom in the infantry before this. I was given an old striker. It happened to be one of the oldest in the Army and one of the worst maintained in our battalion when I received it. And a hodgepodge squad of soldiers, each with different backgrounds from around the world and around the country. But we quickly became a team. I let them know that they were my soldiers, and as my mother always says, I only work with stars. Within a month, we made our striker the best in battalion. We lived in the motor pool because the striker is how we get to work. And as it became the best in battalion, my squad became the most cohesive as we worked together. This is because each of us felt able to bring our whole self to work. There were no secrets, there was no false bravado, there was no hiding. My authenticity inspired that of my soldiers, along with strong leadership and hard work and solid training. We built cohesion in a way that I have never seen in my 19 years of service. That's the value of inclusion. That's the value of having open trans service. From austere conditions in the field to deployed conditions in combat to life in the barracks, I have witnessed firsthand that troops want strong leaders. Leaders who care about them. Leaders who can inspire them. They don't care if that soldier is trans. They don't care if that leader is gay or bi, white or black, male or female. And they don't care which bathroom or shower you use. The question that resounds in their mind are, can you do your job and accomplish your mission? Can you put rounds on target in the heat of battle? Can you look out for your troops' best interests? If a soldier's leader can do those things, everything else really doesn't matter. Thank you for the opportunity to provide my perspective, and I look forward to any questions you have.
Thank you, Staff Sergeant. Now we're going to hear from Hospital Corpsman, 3rd Class Takira Wyatt.
Good afternoon, Chairwoman Spears, Ranking Member Kelly, and members of the committee. My name is Takira Wyatt. I have served in the Navy for 8 years, and I'm a Hospital Corpsman 3rd Class Fleet Marine Force, currently stationed at USMC Camp Pendleton, California. I grew up in the Philippines and migrated to the U.S. at the age of 15. My father, a retired U.S. Marine, and my mother showed us that freedom fosters a person's chances for success. And in bringing us here, gave us the greatest gift, a chance to achieve high goals and to contribute to society. The Navy and my Marines has now become my extended family. For the entirety of my service, neither my sexuality nor my gender identity has led to any disruption among my comrades and peers. In fact, there has been nothing but positivity. Living our truths has made us all stronger, fully engaged, and more devoted to our duty. Though I haven't yet been afforded the opportunity to transition, there was a moment in 2014 that rocked me through my core, and at the same time reaffirmed my commitment to serve. In October 2014, PFC Joseph Scott Pemberton committed a brutal murder of Jennifer Laude when he discovered she was a transgender woman. At that time, my ship was docked in Subic Bay, contributing to joint training exercises with Philippine forces. I was briefed that PFC Pemberton was to be escorted to the ship for follow-up on care while in custody of the Philippine police. I had only heard the headline, "Marine Kills Transgender Pinay." And I didn't think much of it. I was pretty naive until I saw him face to face. During his workup, I looked into his eyes and it shook me. Cliché as it may sound, I saw darkness. He felt cold and was without remorse for what he had done. In his presence, I thought it could have been me. I felt the painful moments before Jennifer's death. Regardless, I had a mission to do as this Marine's corpsman. It doesn't matter who I am. I'm here to treat everyone with dignity, respect, and give them the medical care they need. My duty is to be my Marine's doc, and that is what I'll always do. Ironically, after that encounter, I decided to transition regardless of the senseless violence that could be directed at me for who I am. I told myself I will transition and I won't be afraid to, even if I might face the same circumstances as Jennifer did that night, even if it comes from the hands of my Marines. I medically and socially transitioned in 2015. That year, I was honored to be hand-selected as one of the 2 corpsmen to provide high-risk medical care at the 1st Marine Reconnaissance Course. During a field exercise, my first reconnaissance staff sergeant said, "I've never met anyone who has more balls than you, Wyatt. I will deploy to the stands with you, and I trust you with my life." I had enormous support from my superiors and peers. I was described in the fitness reports as a sailor who is mission-oriented, focused, and is an inspiring leader, motivator, and is focused on team goals. My experiences with my Marines and Navy comrades shows the unique cohesion and readiness are not adversely impacted by having a transgender service member included. I form incredibly tight bonds with the people I've worked with, and I would follow them to the ends of the earth to ensure that they get the critical battlefield care they need from their corpsmen to continue their fight. And lastly, Semper Fi and Semper Fortis.
Thank you. Dr. Ehrenfeld?
I think I'm on. Very good. Good afternoon, Chairwoman Spear and Ranking Member Kelly, members of the subcommittee. It is such an honor to be here today to testify. My name is Dr. Jesse Ehrenfeld. I am a physician testifying in my personal capacity based on my experience as a combat veteran and my background in military medicine and transgender health. I'm also the chair-elect of the American Medical Association and the director of the LGBTQ health program at the Vanderbilt University School of Medicine in Nashville, Tennessee. The administration's military transgender policy disqualifies and discriminates against transgender people who are otherwise capable from serving. I have served and worked with transgender members, both home and downrange. I have seen firsthand how incredibly courageous, committed, and capable these individuals are. I would like to state unequivocally for the record that there is no medically valid reason, including a diagnosis of gender dysphoria, to exclude transgender individuals from military service. This is the position of most major medical organizations, including the American Medical Association and the American Psychiatric Association, all of whom disagree with the Department of Defense's rationale for a transgender ban. There is a global medical consensus about the efficacy of transgender healthcare based on a wide variety and body of peer-reviewed medical research on the effectiveness of transgender medical care. Because of the clear evidence that gender transition is effective in treating gender dysphoria and can improve the well-being of transgender individuals, most third-party payers, including Medicare, provide coverage for these services. A major report noted by Chairwoman Spear earlier by several retired military surgeons generals rejected the Department of Defense's rationale for exclusion, concluding that the Department of Defense's report is contradicted by ample evidence clearly demonstrating that transition-related care is effective, that transgender personnel diagnosed with gender dysphoria are deployable and medically fit. The Department of Defense's report's conclusions that transgender people are not fit to serve contradicts the medical and scientific consensus. Transgender individuals are fully capable of serving. There is nothing about being transgender that diminishes a person's ability to serve in the military. I know this because I have served in the military with transgender people, including in combat. My own personal experience has been that our transgender service members are some of the most qualified, effective individuals we have today serving our country. All 5 military service chiefs of staff testified last year that inclusive policy has caused no readiness issues. Rather, banning transgender troops harms readiness through forced dishonesty. In my opinion, the ban on transgender individuals actually harms unit cohesion and effectiveness. This ban discriminates based on someone who is, rather than what they can do in their job. It will force transgender troops to be dishonest and hide their true selves and their gender identities. Policy decisions, which is your responsibility, impacting our service members should be based on science to ensure that the most effective and reliable force is out in the field. There is simply no medical reason, including a diagnosis of gender dysphoria, to exclude transgender people from military service. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Doctor. Again, thank you all for being here today and for sharing your stories with us. They are truly remarkable. And I'd like to start by asking each of you, many of you have been deployed multiple times. You've indicated as such in your testimony. Can you tell us some of the highlights of your deployments?
Yes, ma'am. One of my highlights was my second patrol on the USS Maine in qualifying for as the second qualified female naval officer to qualify in submarines. That moment right there, there is literal blood, sweat, and tears in those dolphins that I proudly wear on my chest every day. And those are the highlights. My transition is a backdrop of anything regarding my 11 deployments, whether it's trips to the Philippines, trips to Hong Kong, or just camaraderie of spades in Afghanistan every Friday night for about 3 hours and a pack of cigarettes. So those are the highlights of my deployments, ma'am.
Captain Stellick?
Ma'am, I was sitting at my desk one day, and my clinic NCOIC came over and said, Captain Stellick, we got a call from some guy out in Western Afghanistan. And so I went to answer the phone, and the first question I asked was, how do you even know who I am? Turns out it was a Ranger medic assigned to some Special Forces unit who had heard about me from his friends at a different Special Forces outpost that I had been invited to go take care of those folks. And he said, we heard great things about you, and we want you to come take care of us. I was kind of floored, right? Because I came to this deployment wondering how my transition would affect my relationships with soldiers and with command, and to have somebody who didn't know me, didn't know my unit, had never met me, and ostensibly knew that I was trans because he found out about me from folks that I had worked with, found my phone number and got a hold of me to say, can you please come take care of us? That was a pretty remarkable thing to me. And while I didn't end up going because it wasn't the most effective use of resources, there was another physical therapist going that way. It was pretty remarkable, and working with soldiers across that country in a deployed setting was absolutely amazing.
Thank you. Captain Peace?
Ma'am, so my first deployment to Iraq, I actually wasn't called upon to deploy. I'd been stationed at Fort Huachuca for a number of years and had not deployed yet, so I went to our operations and I said, how can I get to Iraq? And the only position that they had open at the time was, I was an electronics maintainer, and this was for an instructor of the new intelligence systems, the Distributed Common Ground Station for the Army. And so I went to a school, I learned the system, and I deployed working directly for the Multinational Forces Iraq G2 out of the Perfume Palace, and spent many nights briefing both her and then updating slides for General Odinero at the time to ensure that they knew how the application of the system was working out in the field with the program manager. On my second deployment, I was stationed in the Arghandab River Valley, which is just northwest of the city of Kandahar. We'd had an IED cell that was emplacing Russian PMN mines, or small pressure-plated mines, or anti-personnel. They'd been modifying them with nails in order to get them to detonate with lower pressure. And we'd seen them appearing for weeks, and we eventually detained a few people. Myself and one of my soldiers, I was a lieutenant, stayed up for, it must have been 24 hours, working on translating some documents, going through some of the evidence that we had and some of the collection that we had requested. And over the next 2 weeks, myself and this specialist had gathered up enough intelligence to provide to the infantry soldiers to essentially dismantle an insurgent cell that was operating within northern Kandahar in the Arghandab River Valley that had already taken life and limb from a number of our soldiers. And after that, those few nights, we never saw any more in our area. And I think as an intelligence officer, having that kind of impact on those who are out there every day is one of the greatest feelings you can have.
Thank you. Staff Sergeant King?
In 2002, during the operation that I had mentioned previously, Operation Anaconda, we were waiting for the opportunity to go out and to do our job. When you're an infantryman, it's kind of like being a concert pianist. You spend all of your time practicing and hoping, in this case, that you never have to go to the concert. But you're ready and you're prepared. Finally, we found out that there had been some issue with some special forces and some Rangers, and they needed help from conventional forces. So we kitted up and we hopped into a Chinook. Operation Anaconda took place on the side of mountains, and we couldn't be dropped off at the top because it wouldn't be safe. So the helicopters backed up to the side of the mountain. It's one of the most amazing things you've ever seen. We slid off the back of a helicopter and onto a mountain, and then hope you don't fall down. We walked up and down mountains for a couple of days. I remember one of the more surreal moments was we had realized that the Air Force had been dropping some cluster bombs, and as a result, as it got dark one night, we had to stop where we were. We couldn't afford to move around. We didn't want to step on the wrong rock, if you will. So I grabbed a rock as a pillow, and I made myself comfortable. We took turns pulling security, and as I laid down that night, we had a Spectre gunship, which is a big C-130 gunship, circling around these low left-hand turns real slow, and you can hear the engines from it. And that was our lullaby. This Spectre gunship, these Air Force pilots who were going to stay, and they were going to circle overnight, all night, to keep us safe, so that the next morning we would be able to get up and climb back up the mountain again, find more caves, find more of the bad guys, to make sure that we would be able to go home and wouldn't have to worry about another 9/11. More recently, I was asked to be a squad leader in a PSD, a personal security detachment. It didn't take long before downsizing caused me to have to be a platoon sergeant. And then halfway through my deployment, we had even more downsizing, and I was asked to be the platoon leader. Our platoon leader had to leave. So I was the platoon leader and platoon sergeant for a 34-soldier personnel security detachment, leading 400 missions. And one of the craziest parts was that it was to protect folks like yourselves. When you're in the PSD for an RC, it's so that the generals there and visiting leaders from within Congress and the DOD can come and be safe. So it was one of the biggest responsibilities that I'd found myself in, because every one of those missions was to make sure that people like yourself came home safe, but also to make sure that my soldiers were. At the end of 400 missions, I have to attribute every bit of the success that we had after that year to the vigilance of the soldiers that I had and the team that we were able to build over that year. To come home in 2002 after having dealt with the trauma that we had in Operation Anaconda, and to compare it to 2014, where we were able to have so much success, it feels good to lead those soldiers and to be so successful.
Thank you. Hospital Corpsman Wyatt.
First of all, Madam Chairman, the opportunity for me to serve with 1st Marine Division, specifically 2-1 and 3-5, those are the best highlights of all in my career. And to be able to be a line corpsman for my Marines, and to be able to work with Naval Special Warfare Reconnaissance course in SOI Camp Pendleton.
Thank you. Last question, I'm Aaron Feld. Did I say that right? Thank you. Can you explain how an individual's transgender status impacts medical readiness and ability to meet standards?
Certainly, it's a wonderful question. Scholars, medical experts all agree that transition-related care is reliable, safe, and effective. And unfortunately, if you read the Department of Defense's implementation report, there are a number of erroneous assertions and mischaracterizations about the scientific research on mental health and fitness of individuals with dysphoria. I didn't get a chance to answer my favorite part about deployment, but I'll tell you a story, which is that when I was in Afghanistan toward 2014, serving as a division officer at the Roll 3 in Kandahar, I got a call from an Air Force colonel who said, "We have a service member I need you to take care of." I said, "No problem, ma'am, what's the issue?" And she said, "Well, the issue is he's transgender." And I said, "Not a problem, we'll take care of it." And the thing about that is I was surprised to find a transgender service member deployed with us, given the current policy at that time didn't allow for open service, and yet here was this person. We took care of that individual. He did fine, was able to continue onward. But what I'll say from that experience is that it's consistent with the department's own data that 40% of service members diagnosed with gender dysphoria deployed to the Middle East are able to serve and don't have any limitations because of their transgender identity.
Thank you. Ranking Member Kelly.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank each of your witnesses for your testimony again. I had the opportunity to meet with 3 of the panelists today, and during that meeting we discussed the importance of every service member being able to deploy. And Captain Peace, I don't know that I can say it any better than you said it. You want your folks to go down range, and when you gave your opening statement earlier, I don't know that I can say it any more succinct, so I thank you for that statement. And I know that you meant it from our earlier discussions, and I really appreciate that. I'm hoping that each of you can explain what impact your transition had on your deployability and what your expectations are for other soldiers who are doing the same. And we'll start with you, Lieutenant Commander.
Yes, sir. So my non-deployability time during my transition was at 7 weeks over the course of 3 years. And that only includes 3 medical procedures, none of which happened during a training event, one of which happened in between patrols and before our pre-deployment training time on the submarine. That is less time than a shoulder surgery that is usually elective. They can go on deployment with needing a soldier's shoulder surgery and get it when they come back. My ability to my transition has had zero impact on any deployments, any readiness issues. I've always been available for training, leading my teams either as a dive officer, which I wasn't very good at, but they tried to make me good at, and or various other training events. I've never missed a single one.
Captain Stalett, and I'm sorry about pronunciations. You know, I don't do those well.
You're just fine, sir. Sir, I can tell you that my transition has had absolutely no effect, not only on my ability to deploy, but also on my ability to get work done. When I had to go to therapy, for instance, as a matter of kind of routine course of care, I was able to rearrange my work schedule to still cover the same number of patients in a week. When I was required to go to an Army school, I managed to do the same thing and do that without having any effect on the timing of that school. And when came time for me to deploy, there were no issues there. I did all the legwork beforehand to make sure that that wouldn't be a problem, and actually sought out the deployment that I wouldn't necessarily have been part of.
Captain Peace.
So throughout my transition, which was really over a period of 3 years, and this isn't something that I normally speak about, but I think it's important, I had 4 medical procedures, and my total non-deployability time was right around 4.5 months. 2 months of that over the course of those 3 years was taken on personal leave. It's important to remember that a single pregnancy from a female averages around 16 months of non-deployability, and that can occur multiple times throughout 20 years or more of honorable service. I think what's important is that it's medical professionals and patients who decide what the most appropriate care and treatment is, but the commanders are brought in to ensure that that treatment occurs when it lines up with unit readiness and mission responsibilities. Things like medical treatment or surgical procedures can absolutely wait until returning from the field, returning from a deployment, occur over holiday leave. There's certainly a lot of accommodations that could be made to ensure that service members are not going and having surgery just before a deployment or before a field training exercise to avoid it, but that it's ensured to line up with mission priorities just like we would do for LASIK or anything else that may put a soldier down for an extended period of time.
Ranking Member Kelly, thank you for this question. My experience is something that highlights how well this can go when leadership, a service member, and a medical team work together. I've had 3 procedures that have been done through the military as part of my transition. The first one was the DoD's first ever vocal feminization surgery. And the doctor that did the surgery, he said, in my opinion, this is medically necessary. And in my opinion, this is a procedure that I think that we should be able to perform. So he did the first procedure of that kind in the DoD. I went to my unit and I said, hey, when's the right time to do this? My commander and I spoke, and what we determined was this procedure that was going to have me unable to speak for about 4 weeks and unable to go to work for about 2. The best time that I could do it that made sense for us was for me to do it right before Christmas time. As you know, sir, most of the time we have Christmas exodus. So by doing this, I shortened the time that I was going to be down because I couldn't speak over Christmas leave. I just used a whiteboard to talk to my kids. And then in the end of January, I was ready to go to the field with my unit when we deployed to the field. Yes. Oh, I'm sorry. I have just one more example. In the summertime that same year, I had a facial feminization surgery. Again, the first one done in the DoD. One of the great things about this is that the doctor afterwards said that this procedure enabled him, he'd never done it before, and it enabled him to do other procedures after the fact because of the technique he learned. I did it in the summertime, right before our summer block leave. I took 2 weeks of summer vacation, and I came back, and the week afterwards, I deployed to the field for 45 days.
And I apologize for interrupting you. You can't pause too quick around me. I'm pretty fast moving. HM3 White.
Thank you, sir. Basically, I was on light duty for 7 days, basically a less than what you would get time off for an ankle sprain. And I had my orchiectomy. And pretty much I expect the same for everyone, service members, that it's mission first, and for both future and current service members.
Now, I think it's important deployability, so I'm going to ask you this question in context, and we talked about this with the 3 people who were in there earlier. You know, I still take my PT test in front of my troops because it's important that they see that, that I either pass or fail. I did a 282 on my last APFT, but it's important to do that in front of soldiers. It's important to be ready. And so I want to ask you, do you agree or disagree? Because different medical things, whatever they are, it doesn't matter whether you're talking about a back, and we talked about this earlier, or a knee, they affect different people. If people cannot deploy for prolonged periods of time, do you agree or disagree that they should be separated from service if they can't deploy for a long period of time, for regardless of the reason?
Sir, the current DoD standard is 12 months, and if they can't meet that standard, then they absolutely should be looked at for separation.
Sir, I concur, and I think that the important point here is that we look at all service members the same, that if you cannot meet the DoD standard of deployability within 12 months for any given medical condition, then you should be separated from service, or at least looked at for the same. The point I think that's important is that we're not trying to set a distinction that if you're transgender, there's a different standard.
I agree. Captain Peace?
So I absolutely agree that we should discharge those who are unable to complete the mission and deploy. The only caveat I would make to that is I would have concerns that in bad faith there would be some sort of non-deployability stigma attached to being transgender. If you start hormones, you're non-deployable for 12 months. That may not be medically necessary, it may not be grounded in any sort of science, but by proxy, it would not allow trans service members to stay in the military. So I would say as long as there is nothing that is applied to trans service members or trans health care that unnecessarily extends their non-deployability, then I agree.
So you know I'm a master fitness trainer. Would you trust me to grade your push-ups?
Absolutely. This new Army combat fitness test, so I'm not so sure of, because I'm not sure that I can pull my knees up to my elbows. I'm old.
As a master fitness trainer, one of the things that we learned in the month of that class is the importance of having the opportunity to recover properly. And what we've learned is that proper recovery techniques, proper PT techniques mean that any soldier, any service member who is training properly is going to be physically fit and have the opportunity to recover. Yes, anybody should be held to the same standards within their gender, or as we go to a genderless standard, and be able to pass. And if you can't, then absolutely, I have no need for you next to me in combat.
I do totally agree, sir. We do put a lot of our members who need higher echelon of care for certain injuries into, I'm going to use military jargon, LIMDU, and then basically be put on med board. And then, depending on how that is, be either accessioned out or be put for another type of echelon of care.
And thank each of you for your testimony here today and your service to this great nation. And with that, I yield back, Chairwoman.
Thank you. Mr. Gallego.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think we have to uncover some deep truths. The fact that Kelly claims that there is a 282 PFT. I want to know who's spotting you, because that's a good friend. I'd like to also take a moment to recognize someone that I actually served in Iraq with that happened to be joining with me, Corporal John Bailon back there, was actually with me in Iraq in 2005 and is here. So I'm just going to give a quick statement. Thank you, Chairman Spear. I had the privilege and distinct honor of hosting Captain Stellick and Lieutenant Commander Dremen in my office yesterday. I've read the biographies of other service members here today, and they are impressive. Their stellar service as nation is a model for us all. We should all be so lucky to be able to shake hands with these people who have shown such devotion to their country in the face of such animus. Chair Spear, transgender people have zero impediments to service. They should be treated like any other soldier, sailor, airman, or Marine, because they are just that, regular soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines. These American heroes want to serve. They are able to serve, and they're good at their jobs. Let's let them do it. As someone who actually served in the combat arms of the Marine Corps as an infantryman, I would have been an honor to have served with many of you, brave people, and I would have trusted my life to you. And this country is lucky to have you, and we should continue to make sure to have you. Thank you. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I would like to cede the balance of my time to Ms. Trahan of Massachusetts.
Thank you. I want to thank Chairwoman Spire for prioritizing this hearing. I certainly want to thank all of you for your incredible service, for sharing your stories, and you are qualified, you are good enough, and we're lucky to have you protecting our security. I know that it was nice to listen to some of the highlights of your service. It would be interesting, just because we've all gone through parts of our career where you know, we've faced difficulties. So I'd love for you to share with us maybe some of your more difficult times in the military. And in that moment, it would be nice to know, was it being transgender that held you back, or was it just a difficult time in the military?
Ma'am, thank you for the question. My most difficult time was my third patrol on the submarine. At the time, I have been deployed for 7 years straight, and in the middle of my third patrol on the submarine. And I was tired. I was struggling personally. I was struggling professionally. We were in the middle of 3 different inspections over the course of 70 days. I had lost personnel on my team, so I was the senior person within my food service division. I didn't have my senior guy that would normally take care of that a lot for me. It was a difficult time. It was also about the time that I decided that I needed to move forward with my transition. Being transgender was not the reason that I was struggling, but it definitely was a additive to the stress of being in the midst of 3 inspections, being underway, and deployed again for a long time, all of which I volunteered for. There was never a point in time where I didn't volunteer for any of my deployments, but you don't turn down those things. So that was the most difficult time. But leading that, my transition had no impact in my ability to continue to do the job, because we still came home with all our supplies and everybody got fed, and we weren't on peanut butter and jelly as we pulled in. So we did well, but that was definitely my most difficult time, and transition made it a lot easier going forward and reinvigorated my ability to continue to serve.
Thanks.
Ma'am, typically the Army just tells you where to go and what to do, right? But when I found out that this brigade was going to deploy to Afghanistan without a physical therapist, I had a decision to make. And because of my life in the current political environment, I felt like it was important to go actually talk to the unit leadership and ask them if they wanted me on the team, because things were a little bit different. That was probably one of the most challenging moments of my life, to walk down to this brigade command office and say, hey, here I am. I would love to go to Afghanistan with you to take care of your people, but there's some things about me that are different, and you have to ask for me. The Army didn't just send me to you, and they won't send me to you. I'm just up the street, and I'm willing to switch places with your current therapist so that I can go, but you have to say yes. You have to want me. And then after 10 years of the Army just telling me where to go, choosing to make that walk was difficult. And at the end of the day, the only question that they had was, wait, you want to come to Afghanistan with us?
There. Thank you.
I would say that the most difficult times in the military for me have been when there was a lack of policy. Once the Carter policy was in place, all of the issues went away until they started getting litigated again. The 2 lowest points in my career were both when there was no clear policy in place. The first one was when I was with the 7th Infantry Division as their intelligence planner. The Chief of Staff Fulbright colonel called me into his office and said, because he didn't know what to do with me and he wasn't sure what the right answer was, he didn't want me in the male bathroom and he didn't want me in the female bathroom, so he instructed me to walk a block or two down the road where there was construction and I was allowed to use the porta potties out there for the construction workers for a period of months, while as a division intelligence officer, I felt like that was not taking care of your soldiers. Second was when I was on leave, I was actually enjoying a little bit of a vacation when I woke up to the tweets from the President of the United States, and I think it was in that moment that I, for the first time, really questioned, why am I still waking up and putting on this uniform when time and time again I am told that I'm not able to serve? Why should I wait around to deploy and risk my life again when the people that I am serving do not even want me here? Ma'am.
Thank you.
Ma'am, the most challenging day in my Army career goes back to that same time during Operation Anaconda. Carrying a soldier, looking for a helicopter that could land on the side of a mountain, and hoping that we got that soldier there in time. It wasn't a soldier from my unit, it was a soldier from a sister unit that had been serving with us. Getting that soldier there and wondering if we were going to have enough time, and finding out that ultimately we didn't have enough time. If I had the opportunity to give back the CIB that I earned during that deployment, to have that soldier back, I would every single time.
Thank you.
Ma'am, for me, that would be around the time, like Captain P said, basically when the policy wasn't out and there was a lot of uncertainty. I was never judged by my job performance. I was basically in a standstill. I almost lost faith in my superiors due to the fact that they didn't know what to do with me. They didn't know what was happening. They didn't know what to follow. There was no orders up top. And regardless of the fact, I still did what I needed to do. I came into the military to be a medical corpsman, to be a hospital corpsman, regardless of the fact.
Thank you. You know, we're reminded, well, we sit here today, and you all reminded us of this in the beginning of in your opening statements, that a key component to building trust and unit cohesion is to be authentic, which you all bring that to your jobs each day, and you brought it here, and I really appreciate all of your testimony. And your focus on performance and standards and, you know, the treatment that everybody should have to, you know, rise to is really admirable. So we're going to set the conditions for you all to thrive. I really thank you for being here today, and I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Cisneros.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, Chairwoman. Thank you all for being here today, and for thank you for serving your country. You know, this is a voluntary service. Nobody has to do it. You're doing it because you want to do it. I had the pleasure of sitting with HM3 Wyatt yesterday in my office and kind of talking about her career. I'm sorry that I missed you, Lieutenant Commander Drayman. It would have been an honor to meet you in person, and hopefully we can chat sometime later. But you know, being a fellow supply officer, I know what you're going through, and I know the Distinguished Award, the Batchelder Award, the good work that you have to do in order to win that. So congratulations on that, and congratulations to all of you on your careers. I just kind of want to, Lieutenant Commander, go over something that you kind of said, right? When you decided to transition, you felt it made you a better leader, a better officer. Could you just all kind of talk about that for me, about how the transition has basically helped you, not only as an individual, but how it's helped your leadership and your career?
Yes, sir. Thank you for that question. The reason that my transition made me a better leader, a better officer, is that I was no longer compartmentalizing parts of my life. I was no longer Blake at home and something else at work. And with bringing your whole self to work, as we require as someone in the military, because the military is not just a job, it is your life. And compartmentalizing that part of your life leaves a piece of you not able to contribute to the mission. And our mission requires all of you. And once I started my transition, having one less thing to worry about, I was able to be better at speaking up during meetings. I was a better leader on the watch floor, in the control room on the submarine, a better trainer with my junior officers as I was training the new junior officers that showed up to the submarine. Yeah, they let the CHOP train the junior nukes how to operate a periscope. So those are the things that you suddenly have the confidence to do because all of you is there. And there is nothing that I can say that would make me want to go back to being a person who would sit in the back of the room and wait to be called on rather than stepping up and being a leader in the room. And I think I can point to my transition starting that. The time period of my award for the Batch Elder was November of 2013 to November of 2014, which coincides with starting my transition.
Sir, you asked how my transition has benefited my career, and I think actually that question remains to be seen. I'm here today defending my ability, or hopefully my privilege, to remain in uniform and take care of soldiers. So it's possible that my decision to transition has dramatically affected my career for the negative, and that I won't be allowed to stay in the military, or that I won't be allowed further professional opportunities. So I think that's really how it's affected my career, is that we don't know yet. That's why we're here. I think, on the other hand, my transition has made me a much better physical therapist, and it's made me a much better officer. One of my friends once told me, she wrote a book and put this quote in it, that people crave authenticity. We respond to those people who you can tell are being genuine. And I can tell you without question that that has been the overwhelming experience of my transition, is that friends, family, strangers, patients all come up to me and spill all of the things in their life because somehow me being me saying to the world, here's who I am, take me as I am, allows them to do the same, allows them to the freedom to say, things aren't okay in my life, but you look like you're doing okay and you were willing to tell the truth, so I'm gonna tell the truth too. I think that makes for a healthier population of soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines. It makes for a healthier command climate. It makes commanders make smarter decisions because they have better answers from soldiers. So to me, there's no question that it's made me a better officer. I think the question is whether or not it's affected, how it's affected my career.
Gentleman's time has expired. Mrs. Davis.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and welcome to all of you. I'm so glad you're here. I had the great honor, actually, to chair this subcommittee throughout Don't Ask, Don't Tell. And so having the early hearings was just so important. And I think in our communities, what we saw was the more people who would come out, basically, and increase the familiarity that people had, that, no big deal in many ways, which is the way that the military received this out in the field. Of course, there were some people who had more difficulty with, but we can't deny that. But I think generally speaking, the transition was much smoother than people thought. And so I just want to thank you, because this is important, and in many ways you have been on the most courageous journey that most people ever take. And it's just good to have you here and talking about this. What I would like to do, I was going to ask you some of the questions about the lowest day and the best day that you've had in terms of general experience, and you've had a chance to answer that, mainly because we want to get to know you. And what is it that drives you to be the very best in your military career and also as an individual, and you've expressed that very well. I'm going to just turn to Dr. Ehrenfeld for a second because I think there is some confusion about the policies, and I'm wondering how, and maybe all of you can chime in a little bit, how do you explain to someone who is really questioning what this ban means? You know, that you're in the service, you've transitioned, and the fact that you cannot obtain medical help if you join as I understand it, if you join the service and you need to go through that transition. I mean, there are some absolute differences in what's being proposed. Can you very quickly just clarify so that I don't leave an impression that could be incorrect?
Appreciate the opportunity, ma'am. Thank you so much. The 2016 policy allows transgender people to openly serve and get the same medical care as everyone else, which is something that is deeply important to me as a physician. The 2018 policy does just the opposite. Under the 2016 policy, individuals can transition gender before or during service if medically necessary and continue to serve. Under the 2018 policy, they simply cannot. One thing that's really important is that I think a hallmark and a really important part of the 2016 policy is that it treats everyone the same. And what you've heard from the panel today is that there is no notion that anyone believes that it's appropriate to reduce the standards for what people should be able to do. And I would actually argue that the department's overall approach has been relatively conservative in the first 2 years of understanding what open service looks like. One quick example of that is that beginning a course of hormone therapy should not, from a medical standpoint, require any extended limitations or inability to deploy. The services have been using a 1-year standard. Now, the author of the endocrine guidelines, which the military has been using, actually has stated that a 90-day window is probably sufficient.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you very much. What do you think people are most worried about?
You know, the three big concerns I've always heard are cost, readiness, and morale on units. We've addressed a few of those. A report today came out about cost, whereas over the last 3 years, the entire cost of transgender healthcare in the military has been around $8 million, while over the same time period, we've spent over $1 billion on the military band, and we spent over $240 million on erectile dysfunction medications. So I think that all of those things, the readiness, the cost, the morale issues that we've heard from Don't Ask, Don't Tell, all the way through the trans ban, I feel as if all of those are red herrings for a policy that is based in bigotry, that is based in denying a group that people are uncomfortable with at the policy level, at the administrative level of government, but not within the military. It's not a concern in the military. It's not something you hear about. It's only through the offices here in DC that we hear any of these issues, and my only conclusion from that is that they're not based on people who have served, but they're based on people who have not served in the military and the natural biases that they hold against people they've never met.
Mm-hmm. Right, I think that's a good point. The familiarity, that not their neighbors, not the people that they invite over for dinner, and that really is an issue that we face in society. Thank you very much, all of you, for being here. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Ms. Escobar.
Madam Chair, thank you so much for bringing this hearing up and allowing us to participate. And to everyone on the panel, thank you so much for being here to share your expertise. But especially to those of you in service, thank you for your incredible dedication. Thank you for everything that you have done for this country, even in the face of what your country has at times done to you. We're going to have a little bit of an interactive session. If you could, so a part of the concern, Captain Peace, you mentioned readiness, that one of the concerns is readiness, and that the accusation about transgender service members is somehow that they are unfit for deployment. If you could, by a show of hands, who on the panel has deployed overseas? Okay, and again, show of hands, who is currently eligible for worldwide deployment? Okay, And then one last interactive question, very plainly put, who here, please raise your hand, believes that this is government-sanctioned discrimination? Thank you. This is a question for Captain Peace. Captain Peace, you began in enlisted service and you're now an intelligence officer, is that correct?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Can you tell us in detail about the promotion process required for you to get that role?
So in order to become an officer as an enlisted soldier, there's a few ways to do it. You can leave service, go through an ROTC academy at one of the schools and commission through there. You can go green to gold, which is a process where you stay in the military, go to college and commission. And then there's also the officer candidate school, which is the route that I took. It requires a selection by a general officer after reviewing your panel or your packet and then also sitting through a panel. Once approved from that, you go to Fort Benning for a 12-week intensive course that tests everything. There's multiple physical tests. There's multiple tests of military history, of doctrine, of tactics, techniques, troop leading procedures, a few weeks in the field, land navigation. It is a course to ensure that we only let those who are qualified to lead soldiers into combat that can graduate from. The concern is that on the very last day of officer candidate school, you don't simply commission to become an officer, you actually sign discharge paperwork as an enlisted soldier, and then immediately following that you sign paperwork commissioning as an officer in the United States Army. That process, that 1-minute window between receiving your discharge paperwork and signing your commission means that you require accessions. And so if this policy goes into effect, no one who is trans will be able to take the same route that I did or any other route to go from an enlisted service member to an officer in the Army.
And aside from what you just described, in terms of the training, in terms of the rigors of what you have achieved, did your gender identity at any point impair your ability to achieve that?
Absolutely not in any way have I ever been held back because of my gender identity or my transgender status.
Thank you. I could easily ask each and every one of you a very similar question. I only get 5 minutes. I believe that the bottom line would be the same for each and every one of you, that the rigors of what you have had to go through have proven that you deserve what you have achieved. It is just that the government is trying to prevent you from achieving all that you can. Thank you very much again for your service. I yield.
Ms. Hayland.
Thank you, Chairwoman, and I thank you also for having this hearing. I'm happy to have all of you here. I just first wanted to say to all of you that I'm so grateful for your service to our country. My dad was a 30-year career Marine, and my mom was a Navy veteran. I traveled a lot as a kid because of my dad's career, and at one point, you know, when it was probably 10 years ago or something, I asked my mom, was she disappointed that none of us, there's 4 of us, was she disappointed that none of us joined the service? And she said, no, you served your time. So I understand that it's like, as a country, all of us should value our veterans. And I just want you to know that regardless of what the president says, there are millions of Americans who appreciate the service that you've given to our country. And I just want you to know that we do appreciate it. It's not everybody who will make a decision to say, I would die for my country, because a lot of people wouldn't. And I believe if there's one person that isn't fit to serve, we all know who that is right now, because that person devalues things that people want to do to make our country better and to move it forward. And although I can't apologize for that person, I can tell you that I will do everything in my power to make sure that we can bring back some civility and respect to the people who are serving our country. So I just wanted you to know that. My daughter's gay, and that doesn't make me more understanding. In fact, I didn't even know she was gay. And I found out from someone else, and I asked her, why didn't you tell me you were gay? And she said, do you think teenagers sit their parents down and tell them they're heterosexual? And I said, probably not. And she said, then why should I have to tell you I'm gay? And I thought, point well taken, right? Everybody should just be who they are, and everyone should accept them for that. And I want you to know that I accept you for who you are, and I just feel like right now, if you tried to be someone you're not, you would not be as effective. And you've pretty much all said that in your testimony. And I appreciate you for being so honest and so, I guess, I mean, I feel like there's so much discrimination in this country, and like those of us who care deeply about that, that's why we ran for Congress. It's one of the reasons why so many of us ran for Congress, because we want to make things right for people, for everybody, for trans people, for immigrants, for people who have been marginalized. And I come from a culture of people who were marginalized. So I apologize for going on, but I just wanted you to know that that there are so many people who just appreciate your service, and I thank you all deeply for that. I guess I could have one question, and that is, I mean, you all kind of expressed your, like, as a low point in your careers is what, this last time when the president tweeted out his tirades of discrimination toward trans service members. And how were your peers? How were the people you served with? I mean, how did they come out to support you? What did you experience from other service members, whether they were trans or not? I'm just curious what the morale is out there with the people that you're serving with. And we can start with, I don't have much time left, but Lieutenant Commander,
yes,
you
ma'am.
can answer the question, and then I might have to yield.
So, in my personal capacity, as I stated earlier, I'm president of an organization that supports transgender service members. And I work in a mostly civilian organization with military bosses and some military people. And the day that happened, they knew that my leadership with my service members was needed for that day. And they sent me home to make sure that I was able to corral my service members, make sure that they were okay, and take care of our transgender service members to ensure that the information that we calmed them down and sent them right back to work, because that was what we were called to do that day.
Thank you, Lieutenant Commander. Finally, Mr. Brown.
Well, first of all, thank you, Madam Chair, for allowing me to participate in today's hearing. I want to begin by thanking Lieutenant Commander Dremen for inviting me last year to be a speaker at the 7th Annual LGBT Pride Day at the Pentagon, and it meant a lot to me. I want to thank each and every one of you for your service and for your willingness to testify before this committee. You know, when President Truman signed the executive order desegregating the armed forces, he said, whereas it is essential that there be maintained in the armed services of the United States the highest standards of democracy, with equality of treatment and opportunity for all those who serve in our country's defense. And then 60 years later, in 2008, Secretary of Defense Robert Gates, while he was speaking at the anniversary of the signing of that executive order, he said, no aspect of Black Americans' quest for justice and equality under the law has been nobler than what has been called the fight for the right to fight. You are now engaged, and we are with you, in a very noble fight for the right for all Americans to fight. So I thank you very much. Look, I spent 30 years in uniform, 5 on active duty, another 25 in the reserves, a year in Iraq. I served with the most patriotic men and women from all 4 corners of this country, straight and gay, black and white, all faiths, all races, all 4 corners of this country. We knew each other. And as you testified today and shared your experience, all we cared about is whether you could do the job. That's all we cared about. And it's my experience in the military, just like yours, that leads me to confidently conclude that there should be absolutely no ban, no differentiation, no discrimination against transgender persons who want to serve in the United States military. And again, I want to thank the chair for allowing me to participate. Here's my question. Based on your experience, particularly as you talked about your peers and the reactions from your peers, and also considering that I think all of you served before 2016 as well as after 2016, given that all 5 military chiefs, including the next chairman of the Joint Chiefs, says that transgender service members have not had any effect on readiness, and that 57 retired flag officers say that if you ban transgender service, you'll actually degrade military readiness. Can you describe what the impact would be on a policy as proposed, this 2018 policy proposed, where you have transgender service members who are serving but are prohibited from transitioning? What kind of impact does that have on morale and readiness and unit cohesion?
Sir, I think that there's a couple things to make clear here, and one is that the 2 policies are very different, right? So currently, transgender people can join the military, assuming they meet all other standards. Soldiers, and this comes to the point that you're making, soldiers now are allowed to seek care no matter what, whether it's trans-related or not. If the policy changes, soldiers will no longer be allowed to seek care. Soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines will no longer be allowed to seek care no matter what. Because if you go to mental health and say, I'm trans, and you get a diagnosis of gender dysphoria, regardless of your job performance under the new policy, you're eligible to be terminated. So we're asking service members to start hiding what's actually going on. You're also gonna, when you look at what Secretary Carter said, when we changed the policy, he said we've put commanders in a bad place because they're trying to retain talent and do the right thing by their soldiers, but the regulations aren't clear. By moving to this new policy, not only are you gonna put commanders back in the same position they were, you're not gonna put medical providers in the same position where they have to figure out, how do I treat these folks and maybe not actually give them a diagnosis so that they can continue to serve because they're doing a good job. I think it's risky and not helpful. I think it makes everybody have to make much more difficult decisions that aren't clear-cut and aren't well-regulated, which is exactly what the policy that Secretary Carter announced 2 years ago was trying to prevent and to change.
Gentleman's time has expired. Let me just conclude this panel by saying that I've been in the House of Representatives now for about 11 years almost. And I can't think of a panel of witnesses that have come before this House that I have participated in that have showed more talent, courage, willingness to put forth a position that is truly appropriate, and do so with the kind of clarity and conviction that all of you have done. You are hopefully going to be part of a education that will allow us to do the right thing. You have shown extraordinary courage. I hope that this House of Representatives shows the same kind of courage to make sure that this bogus policy promoted by the Commander-in-Chief and only postponed because of a court case, that we show that this bogus policy has no business in the policies of the military or the United States of America. So thank you, each and every one of you, for the extraordinary service that you provide and for your presentations here today. Thank you. And we're now going to take a brief couple-minute recess and transfer into the second panel. Thank you all very much.
I'm actually not able to go. I'm doing the Bataan Memorial. Yes, sir, absolutely. Thank you. Thank you.
We're going to resume our hearing. Those of you that would like to have a conversation, please take them out of the room. I'd like to welcome our second witness panel. I understand that Mr. Stewart will be making one opening statement for both witnesses. We respectfully ask that you summarize your testimony in 5 minutes or less. Your written comments and statements will be made part of the hearing record. Our second panel consists of the Honorable James Stewart, performing the duties of the Undersecretary of Defense for Personnel and Readiness at the Department of Defense, and Vice Admiral Raquel Bono, the Director of Defense Health Agency. With that, Mr. Stewart, you can begin.
Chairman Spear, Ranking Member Kelly, and members of the subcommittee, I appreciate the opportunity to discuss the important issue of military service by transgender individuals. Prior to being confirmed as the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Manpower and Reserve Affairs, I served for 37 years in the active and reserve components of the United States Air Force and retired as a Major General. As both a service member and a senior civilian official of the Department of Defense, I have greatly appreciated the work of this committee in support of the men and women of the United States military. Until recently, department policy and practice precluded the accession and retention of transgender individuals. However, in 2016, the department announced significant changes which made clear that no one could be denied accession or involuntarily discharged from service solely based on gender identity. The 2016 policy allowed service by transgender individuals without a history of gender dysphoria or transition, if they could meet the standards associated with their biological sex, to include medical fitness, physical fitness, body fat, uniform and grooming, birthing and bathroom standards. The 2016 policy also allowed those with a history of gender dysphoria or transition to join the military in their preferred gender, so long as they were stable for at least 18 months. Those who were diagnosed while in the military could obtain medical treatment to transition genders. Once transitioned, they were granted a categorical accommodation to meet the standards of their preferred gender rather than their biological sex. In 2017, in consultation with service secretaries and the chiefs of staff, then Secretary Mattis delayed implementation of the 2016 accession standards to conduct a review of his own. It is a common misconception that Secretary Mattis directed this review only after the President publicly announced his desire to return to the pre-2016 policy. That is incorrect. Secretary Mattis ordered a review of this issue nearly a month before the public statement from the President. Subsequently, in 2018, after an extensive review by senior and military and civilian leaders, Secretary Mattis adopted a new policy that will do two things. First, it will maintain the 2016 policy of allowing transgender individuals without a history of gender dysphoria or transition to serve if they adhere to all accession, retention, medical standards associated with their biological sex. Second, it will end the policy of categorically providing a special accommodation for an individual with a diagnosis or history of gender dysphoria that requires a transition. Those service members who relied on the 2016 policy for a session or to pursue a gender transition in service will be grandfathered or exempt under the previous policy. The 2018 policy will not apply to them. The fundamental difference between the 16 and 18 policies is that the new policy ends the practice of providing special accommodations for individuals with a history or diagnosis of gender dysphoria and transition-related treatment. Rather, it approaches the condition in the same manner as the department manages any serious medical condition for both accession and retention purposes, ensuring equal application of military standards to all persons, regardless of gender identity. It does not assume that gender transition is a panacea to the condition and that all treatment options are compatible with military service. This is due to the fact that persons with gender dysphoria suffer from disproportionately high rates of mental health conditions, such as anxiety and depression, substance abuse disorders, and suicidal incidents. Further, as the department has learned, transition care is highly individualistic and requires sustained medical monitoring and intervention, which can have a direct impact on individual readiness and deployability. As the department's report explained at length, gender transition can lead to substantial periods of deployment unavailability depending on the scope of the treatment. As such, aligning accession and retention standards for gender dysphoria and related treatment to a similarly situated medical condition ensures consistency with other standards that present a potential impact to deployability and force readiness. For example, lessons learned from the implementation of 16 indicate that 424 treatment plans reviewed, 91.5% included hormone treatments, which in the case of the Army and Navy is deployment limiting for the first 12 months of treatment. Before I conclude, I would like to address a common criticism levied against the proposed policy. Many have described the policy as a ban on transgender individuals. This characterization is incorrect. To the contrary, the 18 policy, like the 16 policy, prohibits a denial of accession or involuntary separation solely on the basis of gender identity, so long as transgender persons, even those with a history of gender dysphoria, are willing and able to adhere to the standards associated with their biological sex and have not had disqualifying medical treatments, they may serve, and we definitely welcome them. It is important to remember that not all persons who identify as transgender have been diagnosed with or have a history of gender dysphoria. According to the American Psychiatric Association, not all transgender people suffer from gender dysphoria, and that distinction is important to keep in mind. The department's data appears to bear this out. For example, 8,900 active duty service members identify as transgender according to a 2016 DoD survey. Yet, as of 1st of February 2018, only 937 have been diagnosed with gender dysphoria. In proposing a new policy, the department is aware that some former officials and military leaders, along with advocacy groups and certain medical communities of practice, have reached a different judgment on this issue. But as we will discuss today, the realities associated with a medical condition called gender dysphoria and the accommodations required for that gender transition in the military are far more complicated than we may assume. This has certainly been the department's experience with the 2016 policy. As a consequence, the department has concluded, based on its best military judgment, that sustaining the 2016 policy for the long term would degrade military effectiveness and that adjustments were needed in the 18 policy. As new data becomes
All right, Mr. Stewart,
available,
you've exceeded your time by about 2 minutes, so can you wrap up, please?
Yes, ma'am, I sure can. As new data becomes available that better informs our assessment risks, the department is committed to reviewing that data in depth, as it does with all other situations like this condition, to inform our future policy considerations. And, Ms. Chairman, thank you very much for your time.
All right, Mr. Kelly.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. And Mr. Stewart, could you describe the research that went into developing the MADIS policy?
So the research that was done, basically, if you looked at the materials that we provided you, we had the service secretaries, and we had all of the vice service chiefs take a look at this particular issue. We had outside medical experts, along with military experts, all basically provided information associated with this issue.
And thank you. And is just this is kind of a joint question, so I'll answer them both together. Is the MADIS policy a ban? And we had one of the witnesses testified earlier that said you couldn't temporarily transfer to go to school or be promoted or change branches or those things or be commissioned. Are those things true? So is it a ban, and is the statement that you cannot, the people who are grandfathered in can't transfer between branches and those things, is that correct under the MADIS policy?
So the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals determined that it's not a ban on transgender persons serving in the military. So that's the first thing. The second question, sir?
The second question, one of the witnesses testified that you couldn't be commissioned from the green to gold, you couldn't transfer to a temporary school that's outside and come back in if you were grandfathered in. Is that in fact the case, or be promoted?
You are grandfathered under the current 2018 policy. Everyone that is currently has a diagnosis of gender dysphoria will be brought in, and they will be grandfathered.
And Vice Admiral Bono, could you explain some of the comorbidities that are associated with gender dysphoria?
Yes, sir. Thank you. So the comorbidities that we've seen associated with gender dysphoria are typically depression, suicidal ideation, and anxiety.
And then these are real short answer questions. What is the average period of non-deployability for a service member undergoing gender reassignment?
So it depends on the types of procedures they've had. For some of the, as you heard some of the panelists talk about, the recovery time was very quick, sometimes just a few weeks, from 4 to 6, and sometimes 8 weeks. With some of the more extensive surgery, that can go from 3 to 6 months.
And then, Mr. Stewart, final question. How often does the Department of Defense review medical and behavioral health accession and retention standards, and what is the process for this review?
Okay, every 2 years, well, actually every 4 years, but for this particular instance, we'll be reviewing it every 2 years. And what we do is basically look at data associated with those individuals that have gender dysphoria, and we'll basically, if we need to, make adjustments at that time.
And Madam Chairman, thank the witnesses for being here, and I yield.
Thank you, Mr. Kelly. You know, I'm truly astonished by your presentations, I must say. You've just had the opportunity to listen to 5 transgender service members, 10, 15 years, many of them leaders, many of them deployed multiple times. And can you honestly tell us that their service is any less valuable than those of their peers?
I don't think anyone's questioning their service, ma'am.
Well, but by virtue of having this policy, you're questioning the ability of transgender persons to serve.
Ma'am, this policy is not about transgender individuals. This is about a diagnosis. This is about gender dysphoria. We have members out there that are transgenders that are serving in their biological sex, meeting the standards as they are. So
much like don't ask, don't tell. You can serve if you're transgender, but you're going to only be able to serve in your birth gender. So you're going to have to hide the fact that you're transgender. You're not going to be able to transition. That's a policy that is, belongs in the dark ages, not in a military of the 21st century.
And so as far as don't ask, don't tell, I believe was not based on a medical condition. So this particular policy is written for a medical condition called gender dysphoria.
So, Vice Admiral Bono, you referenced that there's this higher percentage of depressions. we already know in the military generally that we have a serious problem with suicides. So the question I have, all military applicants are screened for suicidality and mental health. So trans service members would have to meet those standards, would they not?
Yes, for those conditions.
So to somehow suggest that they suffer from depression would be they suffer from depression just like other service members may suffer from depression.
We do see an association with those conditions with the diagnosis of gender dysphoria. And what we have learned with our transgender individuals is they do have a slightly higher rate of behavioral health visits than non-gender dysphoric service members.
Mr. Stewart, in your written testimony, you cite a single EO complaint caused by the presence of a transgender service member. Yes or no? Did the Department of Defense perform any systematic survey or comparison of the actual experiences of military units with or without transgender personnel?
Well, ma'am, we don't basically...
Yes or no?
Repeat the question.
You weren't listening, I guess?
Yes, ma'am.
Did the Department of Defense perform any systematic surveys or comparisons of the actual experiences of military units with or without transgender personnel?
Not to my knowledge.
Yes or no? Are you aware that the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and all 4 service chiefs testified to Congress last year that there were no, I repeat, no issues related to cohesion, discipline, or morale due to open transgender service?
So I believe you asked them about the service of transgender individuals. You did not ask them about gender dysphoria.
Did they all testify that there were no issues related to cohesion and discipline?
Since we don't track transgender individuals, it would be tough for them to determine whether this particular situation that we're talking about with a medical condition would apply.
Have you conducted a study on how many of the commanders of the over 14,700 estimated transgender service members have faced issues of readiness or unit cohesion?
Not to my knowledge.
You have not. Do commanders at all levels have to constantly deal with medical readiness issues and unit cohesion challenges?
Yes, they do.
Transgender service members have been serving openly and deploying for the last 2.5 years. Many medical conditions such as pregnancy, gallbladder disease, appendicitis, broken bones make service members temporarily non-deployable. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And if you are pregnant, there is evidently a 16-month period in which you are not deployable?
I couldn't answer that, Admiral Bowman.
That's correct.
That's correct. So why is the issue of temporary non-deployability of trans service members seen as something different than that of any other service member with a particular condition?
So the information that we have is that time off or the time away from duty for the Army was about 167 days. For the Air Force, it was about 159. We provide common standards that promote fairness.
You just heard testimony today from each of the 5 service members that their time off was de minimis. Many of them did it during holiday breaks, vacation time, 7 weeks, 2 weeks. I mean, that does not reflect the experiences that you're suggesting.
No, ma'am, and basically we had a panel of experts take a look at this, and this is what they came up with.
Well, did they talk to these 5 persons?
I'm sure they did, but I don't know. I wasn't around during that time frame.
All right. So if I understand you correctly, Mr. Stewart, under the proposed policy, which is not in effect right now because of the court staying it, which allows the 2016 policy to stay in effect, correct?
That's correct.
But under the new proposed policy, individuals who had gender dysphoria, transition genders and no longer have dysphoria would not be able to join the military. Is that right?
That's correct.
Doesn't that sound like a ban for transgender service?
No, ma'am. What it does
Sounds
sound
like
like
that to
is
me.
that basically we are being consistent in our handling of a medical condition.
The reference to a year for hormone therapy, Vice Admiral Bono, according to the testimony by the expert medical professional, he suggested that it was much less than the 1 year that the military is suggesting. Can you speak to that?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you. So when we put together the original clinical guidelines, we were using, at the time, the Endocrine Society's recommendations. This is a very quickly evolving field of care, and so it is very possible that other experience now shows that it can be compressed and shorter than a year. And as Mr. Stewart mentioned, this would be one of those aspects that we would review as we looked at this.
So when might you do that?
We'll probably do it every 2 years, ma'am, is when we go ahead and review policies.
So when was the last policy, 2018?
Yes, ma'am.
So it would be 2020?
Yes, ma'am.
All right. Ms. Trahan?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Stewart, I'm going to be quick because I have a lot to cover in my 5 minutes. First, thank you for your service. Appreciate you being here today. Before this assignment, you were an Air Force Major General. You logged 4,700 hours of flight time in your 37 years in active duty and in the reserves. I'm sure the Air Force invested a lot in you, and it paid off. Do you know the total cost of training a combat-ready pilot today?
No.
The cost to train a single fifth-generation fighter pilot is approximately $11 million today, and I'm sure you're aware of the stunning pilot shortage that we have. 1 out of 4 of all Army, Air Force, and Marine Corps billets are empty, and today we learned that we missed our recruiting goals. Are you aware of any transgender pilots currently serving openly, and if so, how many?
I wouldn't be aware of that because, again, you have to identify yourself as a transgender. We don't track it in the Department of Defense.
Fair. Would you say that this ban is actually counterproductive to the readiness of the military by hindering our retention ability, given the critical shortages that we already have?
And so we were dealing with what you're calling a ban. What we're talking about is a medical condition, which we're basically going ahead and making it fair for all as far as accession standards.
Okay. Well, I just want to talk about the cost and our readiness a little bit, because there is a risk of, as we learned here today, of people who have transitioned to, if they leave service, not being able to come back. And that is an enormous cost to our military and to our readiness. So despite what the President will have us believe, the medical costs of a transition-related health care, it's actually not making a dent in the Department of Defense's overall health care budget. The DoD has spent only $8 million on transgender-related medical costs since 2016. That is only 0.016% of 1 year of the Pentagon's total annual health care spend. So if I'm doing my math right, the retraining cost of losing just one transgender military pilot is 3 times more than the entire transition-related care for the military in 1 year. So my question is, and you probably have figured it out, why would the Department of Defense spend more money replacing pilots we can't even afford to lose when we're already so short on pilots that we're in a readiness crisis?
And so for those individuals, there are a waiver available, but ultimately the retention piece is a very, very difficult issue as far as retaining them, but we're not talking about a transgender individual and kicking them out just based on the fact that they are self-identified as a transgender. The whole policy here that we've been looking at is a condition. And so ultimately, like all medical conditions...
I'm so sorry. I think the outcomes will be the same. We're actually going to add to the shortage that we already have today and put our readiness at risk. But I'm gonna switch gears. Vice Admiral Bono, are you aware that the American Medical Association and the American Psychiatric Association, amongst others, have issued statements reflecting the consensus that a transgender ban has no basis in medical evidence or in science?
I'm aware of those statements, yes, ma'am.
Can you think of any other instance where all major health organizations have issued such a resounding statement on military health policy?
Well, I do know that those studies and their statements are out there. One of the things that we have been doing, though, is following the progress of our own transgender service members and being able to watch to see what their transition and their care encompasses. And so much of what we have learned has been based on the care that we've been able to give our transmember service members in the past couple of years. And that is something that is slightly different from what...
How so? How is it divergent from what the major medical...
So thank you. So what we've observed with our transgender service members is their behavioral health visits are 22 visits per person, as opposed to 2 for the non-gender dysphoric service members. We also see a higher rate of suicidal ideation, and so we take those things into consideration as we're looking at the data and the statements from those professional societies.
Thank you. I've got nothing further. I yield back.
Ms. Davis.
Thank you to both of you for being here. I wonder, Mr. Stewart, if you could share with us about how many transgender persons have assessed into the military since January 1st of 2018?
So the individuals with gender dysphoria, we've had since the 1st of January, 12 accessions, 7 have shipped, and we have about 228 applicants out there.
Is it 12 accessions?
Yes, ma'am. 12 accessions, 7 have shipped of that 12, and we have 228 applicants.
Is there, and I know you're focusing on the dysphoria rather than the transgender, and I appreciate
Yes, ma'am.
From your desire to...
Can I say this? I mean, the fact that an individual has served and is a transgender, we don't ask the individual what their gender identity is. And so it's difficult for us to go ahead and track an individual unless they self-identify. The whole policy here that we've been talking about to date is on a medical condition. And that's really what we're focusing this change on, is a medical condition. Not a ban on transgender individuals. Because as all of them stated here, they all are great Americans and have served honorably.
I think the difficulty is that if there are individuals, and we know we have individuals who want to serve their country, they qualify, they've gone through candidate training school, whatever it is that they've done, that this is to their core, something that they want to do. If we say then that they suffer from dysphoria and therefore we cannot have them in the service, what they're seeking is to be transgender. I mean, we're kind of saying, you know, it's not like some other medical condition so much, but it's we can have them serve with great dignity and distinction once they are through the process of dysphoria. Correct? I mean, that's true that they may suffer from that in your eyes, but the fact that they are seeking to change that medical diagnosis.
Yes, ma'am, I understand your point.
As part of the service, as part of their ability to go on and serve.
Sure.
And to go on and go up the career ladders.
And so ultimately what we're talking about is accommodation from standards. We have other illnesses, or excuse me, conditions out there that basically do not have the benefits associated with having direct access into the military. So for instance, other surgeries that are done out there are not treated the same as this particular condition, which is called gender dysphoria. So if I had a surgery on the outside, it would be disqualifying to bring that individual in under the current standards. What we have right now with a 2016 accession standard associated with gender dysphoria is a special case where we have an individual that we can bring in, and if they meet our standards for a certain amount of time, then we'll bring them on. Not the case for, say, a heart condition or something else.
But what we're looking at is the possibility that that will change, and that those individuals then would not be able to go on and serve their country in the way that they have a calling, and that they're contributing to our national security. I think that what is it about that in terms of what's required for them to make that transition, which is a difficult one, but to make that transition, that is you find, not you personally, but that the agency finds so problematic? I mean, is it the cost alone? The fact that people are going for more sessions with a therapist? I think what we want is for our military who are serving well to access those services.
Yes,
one of the greatest problems that we've had is that they don't, and that they feel that it's not acceptable. And what happens? Some of them, as we know, commit suicide, and their families are affected so greatly by that. So I think that there is this disconnect that we're talking about, where if we could see that as a transition, that it is not unlike some other possibilities that people bring to the service, that we would have the benefit of their service. And that, because when we go through, what's different, what I'm afraid of is that this is sending such a strong message to people who want to serve and who are going to decide that they are not wanted because we're not offering the services that they need. I just don't see that we need to do that. And I guess the other question, very, very, looks like my time is up. I'm sorry, but okay, we'll go through. But it sounds like this decision was not one that people took part in, and that's a problem.
They actually were. They had a number of individuals, to include the individual members that are currently serving, transgenders. They also had, before the panel of experts, both civilian and medical experts that came before them. They had commanders of transgender individuals. And so we had a large number of individuals before the panel of experts that were basically looking at all of these issues before coming up with the current policy.
Mr. Stewart, thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Ms. Davis. Mr. Stewart, would you make available to this committee the transcripts of that particular panel discussion, please?
So as you know, we have current litigation going on right now. So would that be deliberative process? Okay. Because I have a legal expert here with me to make sure that we don't mess up our case, which is currently in the courts. As I understand it, deliberative process privilege is what I'm being told in the back.
Maybe you can ask your legal expert to come forward and join you there for a moment. If
Sure.
you're making, if you have to make your, through discovery, don't you have to make your information available to the other side?
Yes, there's a requirement. If we are in discovery in the litigation, we have the Department of Justice, on behalf of the Department of Defense, has invoked privilege, the deliberative process privilege, over the details of the materials that were presented to the panel of experts. There's general information that's made available in the DOD report, but the specifics of who recommended what,
you can redact the names.
Invoked privilege.
I think that, well, you're invoking a privilege, but has the court upheld it?
No, it's currently being litigated.
That's being litigated. All right. Presuming that you lose in that regard, and that information becomes available to the other side in discovery, then you should be in a position to make it available to this committee.
That's been our position.
All right, and you will do so, I presume, once that decision is made, if it's made in favor of the plaintiffs in the case?
Again, we're represented by the Department of Justice, and they would
all right,
make
we'll
that
know where to
ultimate
go.
call.
Let me just make a couple of points. As I understand it, and this is for you, Vice Admiral Bono, right now it is required that trans service members meet weekly with a therapist. Is that correct, whether they need it or not?
I'm not aware of the treatment plans for each of the transgender service members who are diagnosed with gender dysphoria.
Well, that's what I'm being told, that they are required to meet weekly with a therapist, and in some respects there are experts are saying that that's likely overprescription.
I'm sorry, ma'am.
Maybe could you look into that
yes,
for us and report back? And then I'm also being told that gender dysphoria is treated like other highly treatable conditions. There's post-op, patients are stable and able to serve according to the American Medical Association and the American Psychiatric Association.
Yes, ma'am.
That is the case.
Yes, ma'am. The additional thing for our service members, however, is that after they've undergone any kind of treatment, there's always a medical assessment to make sure that they're fit for full duty. And so we follow all the clinical guidelines from all the different societies that oversee these types of surgeries or any type of the surgeries and treatments, because part of the treatment is also non-surgical. But then our additional assessment for military service members, regardless if they're transgender individuals or not, is to make sure that they're completely fit for full duty.
So I think the concern that many of us have is that if you're going to put a subsequent layer of assessment that is subjective, it can easily be twisted in a manner that could allow for the decision to be made to discharge individuals because they don't meet the subsequent review, in addition to what the AMA and APA suggest after surgery. Maybe I'm not making myself clear. If a patient has this transition surgery,
yes, ma'am,
and they're stable and are allowed to return to active duty, and those guidelines are followed that are available through the American Medical Association. What you're saying is, in addition to that, you do yet another assessment to see if they're...
Yes, ma'am, because part of the service for all of our military personnel is that we have to be immediately deployable at any time, any place. And many of the places that we are sent to are fairly austere or provide fairly rigorous environments. We just want to make sure that each of our service members are in the best condition to serve and that they're not an additional risk to their own health or to the safety of other service members. Generally, the guidelines, the clinical guidelines that we follow with the AMA or any other society for a particular procedure, generally that already meets the bar of being fit for full duty. What we then take into consideration is whether or not they'll be deploying to places where we may not have all of the medical capability or all of the behavioral health capability to continue to provide care if that is needed. So our assessment really for fitness for full duty means that they'll be able to be deployed without any need for additional care.
All right, thank you. Ms. Escobar?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Stewart, I'm very curious about this panel, and I realize that there are some restrictions on us being able to see any documentation right away, but can you tell me, were there to your knowledge, were there any dissenting voices on the panel?
I wasn't involved in it, so I couldn't answer that.
And it was this panel that drove this policy?
Yes, the panel of experts basically were put together by the secretary. The secretary basically got all of these experts together to determine whether or determine what the policy changes were going to be. Ultimately, the secretary was concerned about the fact that the implementation of this policy, and so he called together a panel of experts to make sure that we were making sure that we had the right accession policy in place to make sure that it met all of his lethality standards as far as deployment and those kinds of things.
So one person, it was the secretary, made the determination about who would serve on the panel? Is that your understanding?
As I understand it, the secretary basically called it together and basically identified who the individuals were going to be. In the advanced materials that I provided to you on page 18, we'll go ahead and give you a really descriptive idea of the panel of experts itself. If you turn to it, it'll actually point out to you that the panel consisted of the undersecretaries of the military departments, the Armed Services Vice Chiefs, the Vice Commandant of the Coast Guard, and senior enlisted advisors chaired by, at that time, performing the duties for the Undersecretary of Defense for Personnel Readiness.
And all those individuals work for the Secretary of Defense?
That's correct.
Okay, so the Secretary's subordinates were given direction by the Secretary, I'm assuming?
That's true.
Okay. In your testimony, the written testimony on page 2, you state, those who were diagnosed with transsexualism while in service would generally be discharged, although typically because they suffered from associated medical conditions such as depression or anxiety that were also a basis for separation. Are depression and anxiety treatable?
They are. Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Can you describe what medical rationale might have gone into this decision?
I would defer to the Admiral on the medical side.
Thank you. So what we did is we used the same criteria that we use for the treatment of depression in any service member. And so depression or anxiety, we use the same standards for that, and that is some stability without the need for additional medication over a period of time.
Is every service member who suffers from depression or anxiety treated in the same way?
Yes,
essentially, they would be discharged?
Oh, no, ma'am, not in that same way. They're treated in the same way in that they are evaluated and then a treatment plan. And then for each service member being able to be stable from that diagnosis, then they're allowed to continue their service.
But someone who suffers from the condition, gender dysphoria, would be treated differently, in the sense that the consequences for their depression and anxiety would mean that they would get a different outcome.
So I believe in the new policy, what we're looking at is that there would be a period of stability of 36 months if they did have that the diagnosis of gender dysphoria. So if they did receive treatment and they were stable for 36 months, then they would be considered for accession.
Has there been any evidence of any difficulties in service for transgender servicemen or servicewomen?
So since we don't really track whether they're a transgender, I mean, that's a self-identified condition. So in other words, the only thing that we're basically looking at here is gender dysphoria. We don't track whether a service member is identified or self-identified as a transgender individual. So tracking in the Department of Defense, we don't do that.
Well, if the individuals before us today were any indication of the caliber of service member, we are really losing out on an incredibly talented group of patriots. I have one last
can I
question
answer that?
Because
so,
I have
yes,
my
ma'am.
time's running out, sorry. How is this not discrimination?
we are looking at a condition. We're not looking at discriminating against someone who self-identifies as a transgender individual.
I'm out of time.
Thank you, Mr. Brown.
Thank you. Would you please define briefly gender dysphoria?
Yes, sir. Gender dysphoria is a marked incongruence between somebody's identity, gender identity, and their gender assigned at birth.
Right, and you said incongruity?
Yes, sir.
And what does that mean?
So the incongruity is oftentimes associated with severe distress and an impairment in function.
Okay, fine. So let me ask this question. Got a cisgender male and a transgender male who has not transitioned. They show up to enlist. Under the proposed policy, both, if the transgender male didn't have gender dysphoria, both could enlist into the military, right?
Yes.
That's correct.
Now, if three people show up, cisgender, transgender, who has undergone transition shows up, can the third person, the transgender male who has undergone transition, can they enlist under the proposed policy?
No.
That's the ban. That is the ban.
Now, I say
me
no, but anything is waiverable. So ultimately, no on the surface.
Okay, okay, I understand that. I understand that, but that's the ban. Yeah, I show up, I say I'm a transgender male. Yeah, I get to come in.
No, it's.
But if I'm transgender,
if you identify as a transgender male,
let me ask the question then. Let me clarify, because maybe you didn't get my question. Hold on, no, I'm reclaiming my time. Let me re-ask the question. Yep. I'm a transgender male. Okay. I've been through transition.
Yep.
I want to enlist. Can I enlist in the Army?
No.
That's a ban then on a transgender male who's been under transition. That's where your ban is. That's a discrimination. Because when you undergo, and tell me if I'm right or wrong, when you undergo the transition, you are addressing gender dysphoria, that incongruency that you mentioned, and the level of anxiety and depression and all of those associated morbidities, I think you called them, decrease tremendously. Is that right?
That's correct.
That's correct.
The treatment of transition, or the transition is the treatment for.
So you have someone who's actually taken the steps to address a gender dysphoria, and yet they're banned from entering the military. Isn't that right? Yes or no?
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
And so what you've said, though, is there was surgery done, right?
Look, no. The question was answered. Yeah.
Well,
the transition was done.
The transition was done.
Yeah.
Ultimately, then, there was surgery, and there were other procedures done associated with that. And so what we're saying is that we're providing an accommodation for one group of individuals versus another. Because if you were to go ahead and provide that individual that opportunity, now another individual who has some other type of surgery, like heart surgery, something like that, that individual.
I'm going to reclaim my time. I'm going to reclaim my time, because we are not talking about heart surgery and diabetes. We are talking about a group of Americans who identify as transgender. I have never seen a group of Americans, okay, who are prone to heart attacks, who come lobbying Congress and saying, give us the right to serve, even though the risk of heart attack is very great because I've already had 3 or 4. That's mixing apples and oranges, and I don't appreciate that. I hear about special accommodations. The same thing was said about African Americans when they want to enter the Army, in an integrated Army in 1948. Same thing was said about gay, lesbian, and bisexual members that wanted to serve. And that's where, yes, it is like don't ask, don't tell, because there is a difference. You're gay, lesbian, bisexual, but you don't want to do so in the open, you can serve. You're transgender, and only if you agree not to transition, then you can serve. That's just like don't ask, don't tell. So this conversation about, well, we don't ask about transgender, we just go for gender dysphoria, and then when someone addresses it, they're not allowed to come into the military, that's a problem. I yield back the balance of my time.
Brown, thank you. I'd like to just follow up on Mr. Brown's questioning, because it would appear that the issue around transgender is this issue around gender dysphoria. That's the big concern. If someone has already had the surgery, has transitioned, the likelihood of gender dysphoria drops dramatically. So to Mr. Brown's question, how could you possibly deny that individual the opportunity to serve if they want to?
And I go back to my earlier statement, which is a surgery that was done, other treatment that was done for that particular individual, that provides a accommodation from standards. We have other individuals that would like to assess that basically have other types of surgeries. And so ultimately, ma'am, those particular surgeries keep an individual from coming in. I'll give you an example. An individual that has, as I mentioned before, a heart condition and basically has had the surgery. If we were to go ahead and let them in, well, we don't let them in essence.
I know, but you're talking, Mr. Stewart, of a health condition.
And what we're talking about here is a health condition called gender dysphoria. Yes, ma'am.
No, but they don't have gender dysphoria anymore. They've taken care of it. They've had the transitional surgery.
And so, back to my earlier comment, if they have the surgery, other surgeries are disqualifying that we have out there in the accession world.
Yes, ma'am. So there are
You're not helping your case, I regret to tell you, but go ahead, Vice Admiral.
Thank you. There are certain surgical procedures or certain surgeries that people have that are already disqualifying for military service. And so that's part of the consideration, is that there are surgical procedures.
Can you give us an example?
Yes, ma'am. So surgery for cancers, those are disqualifying for coming into the service. We do know that even though somebody may have had a cancer diagnosis and they successfully have the surgery which cures their cancer and they are in remission, by virtue of the fact that they've had that diagnosis and the surgery, they're disqualified for military service. There are other surgical procedures of the same way. Back surgery is another one. So there's a whole range, and in this case, the surgical procedures for transition are considered disqualifying.
But it's disqualifying in part because if you've had back surgery, the likelihood of you being able to meet the physical standards, or you have cancer and it's in remission, but it's potentially going to reoccur, may impact your ability to meet the physical standards. If you have had transition surgery and you can meet all the physical standards, how can we possibly deny that individual from serving? I mean, you're in a difficult position. I understand.
I agree. Madam Chair,
yes.
If we at some point, I accommodated and went an hour later, and I obviously would at some point if we can. But there is one condition, if I may comment. I had a application for West Point a couple of years ago, and it happened to be a friend of mine, and he had a condition where he was born, his child was born, and I don't know the medical terminology, but it was on the bottom instead of the front, and that was disqualifying. But it was waiver, no, not birth, and it was, and if you know the medical term, please tell me so I don't, but.
Hypospadias?
Yeah, and it was disqualifying, but there's a waiver for that process,
yes.
like there are any medical processes,
yes.
Diabetes or scoliosis or flat feet or sleep apnea, a list of conditions which are disqualifying from entry, but there's a waiver for those if you can show that you are completely recovered. Is that correct, Vice Admiral Bonner?
Yes, sir, that's correct.
All right. Is there any further questions? No. All right. We want to thank both our witnesses. Thank all of you for attending, and this committee hearing stands adjourned.